Here are the answers to the critical thinking practice questions for Chapter 13. First up, a patient with AIDS has a low Th or helper T cell count. Why does this patient have trouble making antibodies? Let's think about what helper T cells do in aiding antibodies. Some of them cause the B cells to mature and to become plasma cells and produce a lot of antibodies. So there are helper T cells that do other things. Some of them upregulate macrophages, some of them help fight extracellular fungi and bacteria, etc., etc. So we're going to look for the answer that talks about antibodies. Th1 cells are needed to upregulate macrophages. No, that doesn't talk about antibodies at all. Th2 cells are needed to aid B cell maturation of plasma and memory cells. So that talks about plasma and memory cells of B cells. That can be the correct answer. And I also didn't have to remember what Th2 cells did. Th17 cells are needed to effectively fight extracellular fungi and bacteria. No, that doesn't have anything to do with antibodies. That is a symptom of AIDS. True, that is a true answer, but it doesn't answer the why question. HIV preferentially infects cells with the CD4 receptor, which decreases the Th cell numbers. That's also a true statement. Also does not answer the why question. You gotta watch out for these types of answers. With multiple choice questions, one of the easiest things to do when you're coming up with wrong answers is to write a true statement that doesn't answer the question. And I'm not alone in that. It's not just me. So watch out for true answers that don't actually answer the question. So the only answer option that talks about antibody production would be B. So how does this patient make any antibodies? Let's take a look at the answer options and see which one would be a correct answer to this question. B cells do not need the aid of Th2 cells to mature into plasma and memory cells. Well, that's completely wrong. They do. They can only make antibodies from B cells that have matured before the drop in Th cell numbers. Well, that would be true. That is a true statement. Macrophages and other antibody-presenting cells can fill in for Th2 cells in stimulating B cell maturation. Actually, I don't know if that's true or not. It could. I don't know. And then B cells do respond to soluble antigens, but weakly. That is also a true statement. So for this answer, I would say this one is definitely a possibility. That is a correct answer. This one definitely happens. It would explain the low levels of antibodies for sure. And this one I'm going to give a maybe, because it could happen, but macrophages and other antigen-presenting cells generally do not interact with B cells, so far as I know. Next up, we have a woman who had a life-threatening salmonellosis that was successfully treated with anti-salmonella, or antibodies against salmonella. Salmonellosis is just a term for an illness caused by the genus Salmonella. Also, what would we call treatment with antibodies that were produced by somebody other than yourself? That's right, passive immunity. And not only that, it's passive artificial immunity. So, why did this treatment work when antibiotics in her own immune system failed? Well, we can assume that she was given antibiotics first. That's generally what happens. And we know that her own immune system failed because she had life-threatening salmonellosis. Also, I let you know that salmonella is a gram-negative bacteria because you might not already know that. So let's look at the answer options. Her strain of salmonella was antibiotic resistant. Oh, that's a beautiful answer. It would explain why the antibiotics didn't work. LPS was released by salmonella being killed by the antibiotics. Now, the reason why I told you that salmonella was gram-negative is I wanted you to remember that gram-negative bacteria have LPS, lipopolysaccharide, in their outer membranes, and if you get too much of that released into the system, it can cause septic shock. Remember that LPS is the most common of endotoxins. Her strain of salmonella replicated faster than her immune system could handle. Well, that would explain why her own immune system failed. Some strains replicate faster than others, so that's definitely a possibility. The salmonella was introduced in larger numbers than her immune system could handle. So, think back to the chapter when we talked about infectious dose and what has to happen before you actually get disease. And one of them is having an infectious dose. And so if you have a large infectious dose or a large dose of pathogen, then it can overwhelm your immune system. So I would say all of the above are possible. Alright, last question. You are in charge of making sure that new employees at your health clinic receive their hepatitis B vaccination. You are also in charge of testing to confirm seroconversion or immunity or development of antibodies against hepatitis B. Recently, you have had an employee that hasn't seroconverted or hasn't produced antibodies to hepatitis B after the 3rd shot. You administer a 4th shot. A month later, the employee still doesn't show antibodies against hepatitis B. Why is this? So we're going to take a look at the answer options and see what would explain why there aren't any antibodies after the series of hepatitis B vaccination shots. You administered the vaccination incorrectly and should redo the entire vaccination round. Well, for those of you that have had Hep B shots, you know that there are 3 of them, and I would hope that you wouldn't mess up on all 3 of them. Not a likely answer. The employee is a carrier for Hep B and wouldn't be able to produce neutralizing antibodies. Well, if you're a carrier, you'd still produce hepatitis B, but you do produce antibodies to keep the numbers down. So probably not. Besides, hopefully you screened for them carrying hepatitis B. The employee doesn't have B cells that recognize the antibodies in the subunit vaccine. That's a possibility. Remember how B cells mature? They go through a process where they make their different B cell receptors, and depending upon what antigen fits into the B cell receptor, they undergo clonal expansion and mature into plasma cells and memory cells. Well, if you don't have the genetics to have a B cell receptor that recognizes the antigens on hepatitis B, you're not going to make antibodies. I like that answer. You haven't allowed enough time for the employee to seroconvert. You should wait another month or 2 before testing. For this one, you have to remember how quickly antibodies show up. And even though it's not as quick as innate immunity or non-specific immunity, your second line of defense, you can start producing antibodies within 3 days. So, month or 2 ain't gonna help it. Now you're probably thinking, well then, why did we wait a month after the 4th shot to do the testing? Why did we wait after the 3rd shot to confirm seroconversion? Well, here's the answer. We want, with the series of vaccinations, because hepatitis B is a serious illness, we want to develop as many memory cells as possible. That's why we have multiple rounds. And the test for seroconversion is testing IgG. And what's the first thing that you produce when you're exposed to an antigen? You produce IgM. So we're testing for IgG because there's more of them, and it's a simpler test, more likely to get a proper positive. So the answer that best answers the question would be C.